Okay, today's lesson is Rescued from Doubt. In the book, I almost forgot to look this up. For those who have the Sunday school book, it should be starting on page 26. Obviously we're on lesson 4, June 27th. For those who do not have the book, that's okay. The scriptures we're going to be reading is Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 to 33. Matthew chapter 14, verse 22 to 33. So I want to open up this story, or open up this lesson, asking, hopefully I can get at least one volunteer and maybe even a second. I will go first to give some time to think about the question that I have up. But the question, or it's not really a question, it's more of a statement. It's tell about a time you made an investment that was either good or bad. So it can be an investment you made that was either good or bad. And when I say an investment, a lot of times when we talk about investment, when you hear about investment, it's usually something financially related. Well, it's always financially related, but it could be usually like a stock or something of that nature that could go up or down. But in this, it may not even be a stock. I don't want you to necessarily think of investment that's necessarily a stock. If you have another example, it may be something that you invested in that you thought was going to be a good thing for you, and it turned out bad, or that you questioned and it turned out really good. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a stock. An alternative to this, if you don't have a example like that, is you could tell about a time that you skipped on making an investment that would have definitely paid off. So either one. And while hopefully one or two people are thinking about what they might share, let me give you a couple. I'll give you two that I had from my own. One of the good ones that paid off for me was I invested in a stock, actually, in Whole Foods stock. And we started shopping at Whole Foods when we lived in Chicago about, what was that, 12, 13 years ago, something like that. And it just was a store that I liked shopping in. They had good produce, so I thought, okay, I'll buy it. Didn't really know a whole lot about it other than that. Now, what I did recognize is at the time we bought it, it had fallen from $50 to $10. So I was just, I didn't know, is it going to go back up? Is it going to continue to go down? Has it already maxed out and it's just going to be trading at $10? But it went as high as $100, and then it split, and then it was sold to Amazon, but that was one that really paid off for us really well. Now I wish I could tell you that we invested $10,000 and made $100,000, but we didn't have that much money. It was maybe $100 worth of stock or something of that nature, just a small amount, but still got a nice return on that. Now a bad investment that I had was I was actually in college. And this is not a stock. I was finishing off my freshman year and didn't yet have a summer job. And I happened to read a paper about, hey, work from home making, so many thousands of dollars a week or something of that nature. It's like, oh, that sounds really good. And so it was one of those things that you have to pay $300 for this material to get, or $200, whatever it was. And so I sent them, and that was one that was just a complete, terrible, wasted investment because I didn't make any money back on that type of thing. So just a couple examples I wanted to share. Anyone have any examples they might be able to share with us? Hopefully at least one person.
I can share.
Sure.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Jay. I had been to grief counseling earlier this year in January after kind of like putting it off toward the end of 2019. And that was one of like the best things I've ever kind of done for myself. I ended up not needing the grief counseling anymore and actually just found a therapist, and I've grown so much as a person and have healed. So that was just one investment that oh my gosh, it's one of the best things. I love my therapist.
Thank you, Jade. for sharing. For those who joined, Jada's my niece. She goes by Jay, I guess. Let me ask you a question there on that, if you don't mind. Were you concerned about going into the counseling, and if so, why?
Oh, yes. I was really nervous about going into grief counseling just because, like, I haven't, opened up, it's like opening up to a complete stranger and talking about, a parent and all the issues. So I was like, Lord, this is going to be a lot. But, it ended up kind of turning out for my good. And then I ended up actually having to find another therapist because the first one I had, she helped to an extent, but then it just wasn't, it was slowly but surely kind of turned into, I guess you could say, a bad investment. And so the new therapist I have now is, one of the good investments, one of the best ones. Who's really helped me along with the healing process. And with her, I was really skeptical because I'm like, I don't want to have to go through this same process again, blase, but I'm glad I did it.
Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. And I will, if anyone else, if another person has something they might want to share, I'll pause for a few seconds.
Yeah, Jamie, I'll go ahead and tell you this. Back in when I was living in Boston, this is going back to 1976, I think. I was working for this company, and I was in the shipping department. And one day, this guy walked into the office that I was, I worked in, the staging area. And he asked if he could have a few minutes to talk about his company. And he said it was an airline. And he said, well, we're a competitor of the people that you normally use because we use a company called Flying Tiger. I think they're out of business now. But they were very big at the time, especially in the East Coast. And I said, well, we have a lot of, stuff that we have to get out to customers right away, and we just need to be sure that you can do it. And while I was talking to him, a representative from the company we normally use, which was Flying Tiger, came in at the same time, and they literally went at each other, criticizing whatever the other person said. And at the end of the meeting, the guy that was coming from, a company I never heard of said, hey, listen, if you're not happy here, I can offer you a job. And he said, you could drive a truck for us and bring, pick up product at different companies and bring it to the airport. And then at the time, they were literally piggybacking on other airlines. So they would buy space on another airline in order to get the product they were picking up there. What separated them was they would have somebody meet the plane, and literally when it landed and product was being taken off, they would get it, and if it was done at a certain time of day, I think before 1 o'clock in the afternoon, they would guarantee delivery. And I thought, then I asked him, well, how much would this job pay? And he says, well, I don't know how much it's going to pay right now. Just trust me. And I decided not to. A couple of years later, I found out that his name was Fred Smith. Well, actually, he told me his name. It didn't mean anything to me then. But it was Fred Smith. And it turned out he was the founder and CEO of Federal Express. Oh. And I look back on that, 40-something years later, I look back on that and I wonder what it could have been like to have been on the ground floor with that company just as they were starting off. They didn't even have their own planes at the time. Later on, he got one plane, and then you know what Federal Express is now. But, that's one of those things where you didn't bet on yourself. You didn't bet on the other person that you didn't really know. And something was telling me to do it. I had this little voice in the head, go ahead and do it. You have nothing to lose. They're not doing anything great for you here. But I got nervous about it and thought, no, I just don't trust the guy. I don't know who he is. I never even knew he was coming in. He just literally walked in and started talking. And later on, you look back and you think you could have been on the ground floor of an explosive company. I mean, everybody knows who they are now. At the time, nobody knew them. And there was nothing impressive about the way he looked or what he did, or just even what he said, because he was literally competing with the guy that that represented the company we normally did business with, and they were paying for space on their planes initially to get their product. It started that way, and then eventually got one plane, and then it's grown into a billion-dollar corporation. One of those things that you look back on and regret. You don't know how it would have turned out, but I kind of think that it turned out pretty good for him.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Wow, what a story. No, and I understand that, and I understand about about being concerned about doing any sort of investment in anything, and that's one of the reasons why I asked Jada about hers. You know, hey, did you have apprehension going into this? And it's like, yeah, absolutely, because in financial terms, and when we talk about an investment, they obviously talk about risk. And in the financial terms, risk is defined as the chance that an outcome or investment's actual gains will differ from an expected outcome or return. So in other words, if I put money in, the risk is that it's expected to go up, but the risk is that it could go down. Or maybe it does go up, but it doesn't go up as much as they forecast it to go up. So generally, the higher the risk, the higher the expected return is when it comes to that type of situation. So in Harry's story is a great example of there was a whole lot of risk, but the return, had he done that type of investment, you know, who knows what it could be. The sky's the limit right now. He might not be talking to Harry right now. So risk is a form of uncertainty. Just like even in Jada's example, you know, there was a risk in going to do this because there was some uncertainty. Uncertainty is just a lack of knowledge of what the outcome will be. And so because of that, that leads to doubt. And doubt means that it's a lack of confidence. Now, I have a little bit of a posing question here. What if I told you I could offer you an investment that costs no money, has absolutely no risk? In other words, what the expected outcome you could have, it's going to happen. There is no variance in the return. So in other words, it yields the maximum return. I'm sure that everyone would, well, you probably, if it was an actual stock investment, your ears would perk up, and you'd probably be a little bit set on edge, like I don't know if I trust that. But in Jesus, what I'm here to tell you is that we have that. There's absolutely no risk. It costs no money. It yields a maximum return. Matthew 25:29 says, "For unto everyone that hath shall be given, and he shall have abundance. But him that has not shall be taken away, even that which he has." What I have underlined on this is the word given. For unto everyone that has shall be given. The talents that we have are given to us. There's a parable that Jesus talked about talents. And if you go back and read that parable, each person was given a talent. One person was given 10, one given 5, one given 1, and hopefully everyone's familiar with that story. Basically, the one who had 10 went and made another 10. The one who had 5 went and made another 5. The one who went 1 basically didn't use the talent that was given to him. Didn't work for it, didn't cost him any money, had no risk, and had the opportunity to yield maximum return, but he did not use that talent. And so what happened to that talent? It was taken from him and given to the one that had the 10 talents. So where I'm going with this is that each one of us is given at least one spiritual gift, but it's doubt that keeps us from using it. And that's the subject of our lesson. So I know it was a roundabout way to get there, but hopefully it's starting to connect everything about why I wanted to talk about this investment. It costs no money for us. It has no risk, but can yield maximum returns. So hopefully as we go through this lesson, you'll receive some points dealing with doubt about using the gifts that God has invested into you. So let's get into the story. So the first thing I want to do is I want to give just a little bit of a background to talk about where we are in the story of Jesus' ministry upon the earth. So the background is Jesus he was at Nazareth, and prior to the story where we pick up, and he was rejected at Nazareth. For those of us who are Bible scholars, you know that, or Bible studiers, you know that Nazareth is basically where Jesus was from, where he was raised. So he's back at his home country. He's rejected there. They didn't accept him, basically saying, hey, isn't this Joseph's son, the carpenter's son? So they rejected him. So he left, and he departed to Capernaum. Now, on the screen, for those that are online, you can see I have a map up. Now, Nazareth, for those that don't have it, I'll do my best to try to describe it. But it's basically, imagine like a big rectangle where the short side is on the bottom and the long side are going up the side of the rectangle, okay? If you, in the middle of the rectangle is the Sea of Galilee is what I'm showing, okay? Capernaum is near the top of that rectangle, okay? Nazareth would be on the, if you're looking at the would be on the long side towards the left, okay? For those that can see my screen, if you can see my mouse, it would be somewhere over in this area. But so Nazareth, he departed from Nazareth and he went up to Capernaum, which is at the top of the rectangle, near the top of the Sea of Galilee. Now, while he was there, he empowered his disciples to go and he gave them power against devils. And so this is when they went out and started casting demons out of people and that kind of thing. Now, when he did that, he stayed back. And during this time, he gets wind of the death of John the Baptist. King Herod had John the Baptist beheaded, and he heard of this, and the Bible states that he went into a desert place. Actually, in Matthew 14, verse 13, it says he went to a desert place. If you go into Luke 9:10, it says that he departed to Bethsaida. And he went there likely to mourn the passing of, or the killing of John the Baptist. Now, Bethsaida, you can see it on the map, but if you were for those that have this image of a rectangle, and you're somewhere close to the top, but not quite the top of the rectangle, that's Capernaum, it would actually be in the middle, like top middle of that rectangle. So if you just came to the right, towards the right corner of that rectangle, that would be Bethsaida. And that's where this particular story picks up. Now there, just before the story we're about to read, he reconnects with his disciples from being out, casting out demons and that kind of thing. And he actually feeds the 5,000 in Bethsaida. All right, so that's a little bit of the background of what happened transitioning up to the story we're about to read. So we're going to go to Matthew chapter 14, verse 22 to 24. And in the book, if you have it, is page 27. I'll go ahead and ask for a volunteer to read those three verses if someone would be so kind. Matthew 14, 22 to 24.
I'll go ahead and read it. Okay, I'll be doing the international version.
Okay.
Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it.
Thank you, Harry. Okay, so that's all straightforward. Jesus dismisses the crowd of the 5,000. I should say 5,000 men. It's not talked about women and children were there, so it easily could have been over 20,000 people. But regardless, he dismisses the crowd, and he tells the disciples to go on ahead and get into the boat and to sail over to another area. He stays back and he prays. Okay. Now, I am going to ask for crowd participation in this. So if you would be so kind and indulge me, this lesson is a lot about engaging the crowd and asking some questions and try to draw out some points. So the first question I have, and they're very simple questions, by the way, so hopefully multiple people can participate. What did Jesus command the disciples in this story?
To cross over.
He commanded them to cross over. He commanded them to get into the boat and to cross over. Okay? Now, so the follow-on question I have to that, what do we know about the commandments of God?
They never fail. They all come to pass.
They never fail. They all come to pass. That's absolutely right. So that's the first point that I'm hoping that you can get from when we have that doubt that creeps in from using what God has given us. God's given it to you for a purpose, and He's commanded things of you, and that we need to understand that His words never comes to pass. His words never fail. They always come to pass. Isaiah 55:11 says, "So shall my word be that goes forth out of my mouth. It shall not return unto me void, but it shall accomplish that which I please, and it shall prosper in the thing whereto I sent it." So again, that's the first point. God's commandments come to pass. So if God has commanded you to do something, we'll get into about that uncertain feeling, but the point is we're talking about being rescued from doubt. So that's the first point I want you to really grasp. Now, while the disciples were in the ship, what did Jesus do? What was Jesus doing?
Well, after he had dismissed the crowd, he went up on the mountain to pray. He needed some alone time with the Holy Father, so he was praying after he got them into the boat.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you. I told you these are going to be easy questions. They're all straight from the lesson for the most part. So yeah, Jesus was praying. Now, I want you to think about this a little bit. If I asked, do you think Jesus was praying for food, clothing, or his physical needs, I would hope everybody would understand he'd say absolutely not. Because he just fed 5,000 people with, I forget what it was, 2 fish and 7 loaves of bread or something like that. I forget the exact number because he did 2 miracles of feeding a multitude, and I forget which one's which. But regardless, he's been teaching the disciples, don't worry about food, don't worry about clothing, don't worry about your physical needs. God's going to take care of all that. So we know he wasn't praying about that. He wasn't concerned about that. So what else would or could he be praying for? Well, I tend to believe he was praying about God's will being done in the lives of others. And perhaps even at this moment, he's making intercession for the disciples because, again, we have to remember that Jesus is God. So he had to know what the Father had in store for them being out there on that lake or on that sea. Hebrews 7:25 says, Therefore he is able to save them to the uttermost that come unto God by him, seeing he ever lives to make intercession for them. And then Romans 8:34 says, Who is he that condemns? It is Christ that died, yea, rather, that is risen again, and here's the point I wanted to get to, who is even at the right hand of God, who also makes intercession for us. So when Jesus went up to the mountain to pray, now it doesn't say who he prayed for or what he prayed for, but rest assured, Jesus was making intercession. And I tend to believe he was making intercession, at least part of the intercession was for the disciples that were on the boat. So that's the second point that I want you to understand. Jesus is at the right hand of the Father, as it says in Romans and in Hebrews and in other places, and he's making intercession for us. So again, that you got to understand that when that doubt creeps up, Jesus is making intercession for you. So you just got to trust and believe in him. Now, the other thing I want to bring out from this section before we go to the next section, do you think it is a coincidence that the storm occurred at this particular time?
No, actually, I think it was by design. That the reason why there was he immediately he commanded them to get in the boat and go away was because there's something in John, I think it's John 6, where John mentions that there was a crowd there, same crowd that had been fed, was interested in making Jesus king. And he wanted to get the apostles away from them, because some of them may have had the same thought. Well, we know at least one or two of them did, because Simon was a zealot, and Judas was also of that. Had the same kind of thinking, that they were looking for a Messiah that would be a ruler or a fighter. And so I think Jesus that might have been what he was, one of the things he might have been praying for, was that, to keep them covered, to keep them protected from that kind of thought. And so I think he sent them into the storm knowing it was coming. He didn't tip them off. He didn't tell them anything. But he knew. He's God. He knew.
Absolutely. No, and I agree with you, Harry. And I wanted to read the definition of coincidence. Coincidence, one definition that I read was a remarkable concurrence of events or circumstances without apparent causal connection. So in other words, it's a series of things that happen out, put it in Damien talk. It's a series of things that happen that just seem to be random. And then because of this randomness, this remarkable event happens, or this remarkable occurrence happens. Well, God is a God of order, as Pastor was talking about earlier. And he orders everything. He directs everything. And so I do not believe, coincidence is one of those things I think that we should be able to take away from our vocabulary, or at least we as Christians got to understand that everything that happens to us is by design by God. And there's no such thing as a coincidence in God's vocabulary. And that's why I believe you. That's why I agree with you, Harry, that I don't think it's coincidence that this storm just happened to happen. And I don't think it's coincidence at the timing that it happened. I believe that this was another potential lesson for the disciples. Now, Matthew 10:29 says, "Are not 2 sparrows sold for a farthing, and one of them shall not fall on the ground without your Father?" Now, the reason why I read that, first off, a farthing is a British term. It meant a quarter of a penny. Now, we don't have a currency that's a quarter of a penny. A penny is the smallest we have. But today, a quarter of a penny would be worth about 40 cents, 0.4 US dollars. But the point that is being made here is that in this verse, "Are not 2 sparrows sold for a farthing, yet one shall not fall to the ground except the Father know," is that God cares for even the smallest thing, even 2 sparrows that are sold for a quarter of a penny. They're sold for next to nothing. But yet God has control over whether one dies or not. So if he's concerned about the even smallest thing, there's no way that even a big thing like a storm can be just a coincidence. And that's the point that I want to make. And that's the thing that's the other point that I'm hoping that we have. There's no coincidence that we have the abilities that we do. There's no coincidence that God has us where he has us. There's no coincidence, and so we don't have any reason. If a situation comes up and you have an answer for someone or words of wisdom for someone or can guide someone, and God's placed you in that position, it's no coincidence that you're in that position, and you need to be reaffirmed that God is in control and has you there for a reason. Now, I'll pause in case anybody has anything else that they would like to add or any questions. Then we'll go to the next section. Okay. All right, so we'll go to Matthew chapter 14, verse 25 to 27. The section's called Jesus Walks on the Water in the book. And if I could get another volunteer to read those 3 verses, please.
I'll do it, Dave.
25. Oh, somebody's reading it? I didn't.
No, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, you can go ahead. I'll listen.
No, go ahead.
Okay, Matthew 14, 25, 27. I'll read the NIV.
Okay.
Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid."
All right. Thank you, Lois.
Mm-hmm.
Now, before we get into the questions I have about this section, again, I don't feel I need to add a whole lot more. The only thing I will explain is about the watch. I don't know if everybody is familiar with the first watch, second watch, third watch, fourth watch, and it says in the fourth watch, or in the King James Version, it says in the fourth watch. In the New International Version, it says before dawn. But they had this thing called watches that they did, and it was basically from sundown to sunrise. And they broke it up into 4 segments. So it was roughly 4 3-hour segments from roughly 9 p.m. to midnight. Wait a minute, I'm sorry. 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. was first watch, roughly. 9 p.m. to midnight would be second watch. Midnight to 3 a.m. would be third watch. And 3 a.m. to roughly 6 a.m. would be the fourth watch. So it's early in the morning when Jesus comes. And like I say, in the New International Version, it says before dawn. But the first question I have for us to ponder, how did Jesus walk on the water? It says he came walking on the water. How did Jesus walk on the water? Well, this one is one that really science can't explain. And if we talk to a lot of unbelievers, it's like, hey, and they would naturally reject it because man can't walk on water. You go off into a pool and go try to walk and see how that does. I hope you can swim because you're going to go down. So science can't explain it, and natural man will reject it. However, when you understand John, if you go back and read John chapter 1, the Gospel of John chapter 1, and just read down to verse 3. We're not going to do it today, but it talks about how all things were made by him, and it's referencing Jesus. As you keep reading down, I think you get somewhere around verse 6 or so, or maybe it's verse 10, and it references that the Word became flesh, and that became Jesus. That was Jesus. That all things were made by him. So when you understand that all things are made by him, then it becomes easy to accept that he is above natural law. He created natural law. So because he created it, that means he's above it. That means that he can break it. And so that's how he ends up walking on water. Now, that is actually part of the fourth point, that we got to understand a little bit whom we serve, that he's above all things. He created all things. And that gives us further reason to not doubt. Now, getting back to maybe a little bit easier question, what was the situation when Jesus appeared, I say to them, but I mean to the disciples? So in the story, what was the situation that they were encountering?
It was a storm. I mean, the waves were buffing them about.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And if you read, I think Harry started mentioning about John chapter 6 earlier. I believe it is John chapter 6 where this story is paralleled. It said that they rode in that one 25 to 30 furlongs. Now, I didn't know what a furlong is. I had to look it up. But basically, that's about 3 to 4 miles they were rowing. And again, remember, this is 3 a.m. that Jesus is coming out to them. Now, I had a map up earlier of that area, and the widest part of the Sea of Galilee is like 6 miles, and they're rolling 3 to 4 miles. Now, from Bethsaida towards Capernaum, where they were in the direction they were headed, has to be about 3 to 4 miles. And Jesus sent them out before first watch, so they were out there toiling for, what is that, 9 hours or so, to only go about 3 to 4 miles. That's a very, very short distance. But Mark says they were toiling and rowing. And toiling means that they were in torture. They were pain from exertion. Not sure if there's a whole lot of people that still exercise or work out, but if you've ever lifted weights, you know, there becomes a point where it just becomes painful because there's so much lactic acid that builds up in your muscles that it becomes like torture. So that's effectively how they were. Now, this situation can be like us in our current life. You know, we have situations that come against us that seem like a storm. Yeah, it's not a physical storm, but whether it's some form of depression we're going through, some childhood experience we had, something we're dealing with our parents, anything. And we can be fighting against this instead of recognizing whom we serve and submitting our will to him in that situation. Now, Mark 6:48 says, and he saw them toiling and rowing. And there's a little bit of humor in this one, in this verse as I kept reading it. It says, Mark 6:48 says, and he saw them toiling and rowing, for the wind was contrary to them, or against them. And about the 4th watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea. And here's the humorous part. It says, and would have passed by them. That to me is a little bit funny because in another version it says that Jesus was on the bank and he saw them out there toiling and rowing. I think that's the Matthew version. In the Mark version, he's walking, and he's not walking necessarily towards them. He's walking in the same direction that they're going. And it's a little bit humorous to me because I'm picturing him like, look at them over there. I told them to get into the boat and to go over, and why are they panicking about this? Like, they should understand that I told them to do this, so this is what's going to happen. And that's what makes it kind of humorous to me, that it says, and he would have passed him. But then they did something, and we'll get into that in just a second. But one of the things that the 5th point I want to draw out is that Jesus or God sees you in your situation, just like how Jesus saw them in their situation. But he's waiting on one thing, and that's the next question that I have. What was the one thing in this situation that the disciples did right?
They asked for help.
They asked for help. They reached out. They called. They cried out to him, right? They cried out to Jesus. And then you hear Jesus' response. Now in Mark, it said he was walking as if he was just going to walk right past them. But then they called out, and then he said, "It is I, be not afraid." And then he came unto them, and they received him into the boat. So that's the sixth thing that I want us to recognize when we have this doubt creeping up, is that we need to cry out to Jesus. Jesus is in our lives. And he's like that boat, like we're like the disciples in that boat, and we're going out here fighting, and Jesus is walking right alongside of us, and he's like, "I'm right here, but if you don't want me, I'm just going to keep walking. I'm going to keep moving until you call me to you to help you in that situation." So that's the next thing we need to know, is that we need to cry out. And the key is that God has already done his part. God's already given us Jesus to save us, and he's already given us the Holy Spirit to bring us to him. So the move from this point on out is on us. It's not on him. Romans 1:13 says, "For whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved." That just furthers my point. We have to do our part in calling out to him. And so we'll go to the last 6 verses. Matthew 14:28-33 in the book is called Jesus Rescues Peter. And it's on page 29 if you have the book. Does someone want to finish off these verses?
I do it, Dave.
Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead, Dad.
And Peter said unto him and said, Lord, if it be thou, bid me come unto thee on the water. And he said, Come. And when Peter was come down out of the ship, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. But when he saw the wind boisterous, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried, saying, Lord, save me. And immediately Jesus stretched forth his hand and caught him and said unto him, O thou of little faith, wherefore didst thou doubt? And when they were come unto the ship, the wind ceased. Then they that were in the ship came and worshipped him, saying, Of a truth thou art the Son of God.
Thanks, Dad. Okay. Again, not a lot I need to add here. It's pretty straightforward. Peter asked him to come out. Jesus said, come out. He looked at the wind, started to sink. He called out to Jesus for help. And Jesus reached out his hand and helped him. And then he gets in the ship and they start worshiping him. Now, I want to take a little bit of a different spin than what a lot of people take on this, a lot of pastors. And they're not wrong in what they bring out. There are different points that can be brought out of every story. But I felt God moved me in this direction. The first question I have, who do you think had more faith in this particular situation, Peter or the disciples?
This is one of those that's kind of hard. You know, I struggled with trying to figure out what Peter's motivation for getting out of the boat was.
Sure.
Because it was the safest place to be would have been in the boat. And why he wanted to get out, we don't really know. But it's not really clear that the disciples that didn't get out of the boat were afraid to get out. It might have been they were waiting to be rescued. And if Peter was a little more frightened than they were, that might have been his motivation for going where Jesus was, because he knew that the safest place to be would have been right next to him. And I think that's that could have been what motive. I don't know for sure, but we'll never know that. But that could have been it. You can make a case for that. And it goes back to how he got out of the boat. He said, Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to the water. Why didn't he just say, Jesus, I'm coming to you, unless you forbid it? He's asking to be commanded to get out. It's almost as if he needed that to move him. And the others didn't ask at all. I think they were waiting to be saved. They knew they needed it. But Peter was the one that he had the courage to get out. You can't take that away from him. Sure. And he had faith in Jesus, knowing that if he commanded it, then he had to make it happen. It's just not really clear how it benefited him to do that.
Sure. And you bring up some good points, Harry. Go ahead.
Okay, brother, because I go back to the last verse that we read, number 27, where Jesus told him, he said, it is I. But then Peter says, Lord, if it's you. It seems like to me, I don't know, he's questioning what Jesus has just said to him. That's what I'm thinking. Why would he say, Lord, if it's you? Jesus just told him, it is I, don't be afraid. So I'm trying to wonder if maybe Peter was questioning whether that was really Jesus, so he was testing it out. If he say, well, if I can walk on the water, then it must be him. I don't know. That's what I thought when I saw that.
Sure. And like I say, there are multiple different points that can be brought out. And some of it is we can only speculate. Mm-hmm. And even what I say a little bit is a little bit of speculation, but there was something that Harry said that is the real point that I want to bring out. Now, it's true. Nowhere in the Gospels of this story it says that the disciples said anything. They said nothing, and they remained in the boat. Peter at least had the faith, or as Harry put it, he had the courage to at least step out of the boat. Now, what his motivations were, I don't know. I could only speculate. I don't know. But I truly believe that Jesus saw that Peter, even though he made mistakes, and people talk about Peter, he always puts his foot in his mouth, and he's the vocal one needing to be seen, and there is some truth to that. There are some truths to that. But at the same time, he had a courage that none of the other ones had. Not until possibly later on in their lives. And Jesus knew that would be beneficial for his kingdom. And if you look at a lot of things that happened, a lot of the big things that happened when Jesus was on the earth, Peter was always there with him. Now, John and James, it says, were there with him as well. So they had something, that Jesus valued possibly even above some of the other disciples. But the point I'm making here is the disciples remain in the boat. So to a degree, an argument could be made that Peter had a bit more faith to at least even to go out and step out onto the water. But the big thing I want to pull out is the courage that he had. Now, and how Jesus saw that as beneficial for his kingdom, to use that courage that Peter had. And what I want to draw out, and this is another point that I want you to get, is that you have something that Jesus sees beneficial for his kingdom as well. And just like Peter did, we have to learn to step out on faith. Romans 8:28 says, and we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose. Everything I'm trying to get you to understand, or hoping that you got, is for God's purpose. Everything that happens in our life, everything that happens, this story, the situation that happened with Peter, it happened for a purpose. And it's according to God's purpose is the reason why it called. And we know that all things work together for the good, as Romans 8:28 says. So how was the disciples' situation similar to Peter? So what I'm referencing here is Peter's now out on the water, and he's out of the boat, and now the other disciples are still remaining in the boat. So how were the two situations similar? Well, I'll give you my proposed. Is somebody saying something? Sorry, go ahead.
Both of them were focused on the storm, huh? Because Peter started sinking because he was still afraid of the storm, and the people in the boat were afraid of the storm. So both of them were afraid of the storm still, because that's why Peter started sinking. When the wind came up and he lost his focus off of Jesus.
Absolutely. You're exactly right. That's one of the points, and the other point we actually covered earlier. So how they were similar, both were commanded to do something. We talked about that earlier. That was one of the very first points about Jesus commanding them to go into the boat and go to the other side. So they were both commanded to do something. Peter was commanded to come out and onto the water to walk to him, and they were commanded to go on to the other side. Both experienced a storm and began to fear. And then there's a third point too. Both needed Jesus' intervention before their hearts were settled. Peter needed Jesus' intervention to pull them up from sinking. The disciples needed Peter's interventions to relax in the midst of this storm that was going on. Now, one of the things I wanted to bring out as well is this particular storm took place after Jesus had calmed the storm. What I mean is there's another story in the Bible where Jesus and the disciples are in the ship, and a storm comes, and they start panicking, thinking, "Oh, we're about to die." And in that story, does anybody remember what Jesus was doing?
Oh yeah, he was sleeping.
He was asleep on a pillow. The Bible says he was asleep on a pillow in the boat. That means he wasn't worried about the situation at all, because he knew, well, God said we're supposed to go from here to there. And yeah, we may encounter a storm, but we're going to get to where we're going because God commanded it. Now, within us, as we have situations that occur in our lives that are like a storm, we may see things, oh, well, that's a little bit different because Jesus was with the disciples at that time. He was with them, so they didn't have anything to worry about. Well, my question to you or that person that would make that statement is, well, what about the Holy Spirit? Is the Holy Spirit not given to those who are saved? Is the Holy Spirit not part of the Godhead? So we have God with us as well. So just like their hearts should be settled, our hearts should be settled in the midst of our storms that we go through. And that's the next point that I wanted to provide there. Now, last question I have in this story before we wrap this up was, what was their enlightenment after this occurrence? So now Jesus is now in the boat. Both Peter's been rescued. The disciples have been rescued. What was their enlightenment after this?
Well, they say, truly you are the Son of God. But,
absolutely.
But that puzzles me because they've been with him and seen all these other things. They're just coming to the realization that he's connected with God. That part kind of baffled me when I read that.
Hey, I might be able to help you maybe. If you go to verse 27, it says, "But Jesus immediately said to them, 'Take courage, it is I.'" I've seen translations of "it is I" in Greek. Ego eimi translates to "I am." Think about that for a moment. I am, the divine name. It also, "it is I" translates back to Hebrew as Yahweh. So when he identified himself on the ocean, not on the ocean, on the lake, he gave the divine name. It's not just saying, "Hey, it's me, Jesus, you know me." He was given a divine name. And it makes sense to why he chided Peter about not having faith, or not having enough faith, because he identified himself as God. He walked on water. He allowed Peter to walk to him on water until Peter became afraid. So when you put the things together, it makes sense that they would finally get it. He had fed thousands of people before, earlier in the day. Before that, he had calmed the wind and the waves when they were caught in a storm before. So I think at some point they had to realize this is God.
Well, that makes sense.
And that's why they worshipped him when he came aboard. When he got on board, they all worshipped him. They all came to the same realization that this is God, and he's also man. It would have been very hard for them to understand it, but I think they finally got it.
So, Harry, up to this point, what were they thinking of him as being what? Or who?
Well, they probably thought of him as a great prophet and teacher with powers that God bestowed upon him. But they didn't see him as God at that point.
Yeah, I see the distinction.
They didn't totally accept it. But if you go back to Matthew 8, where they were on the boat and they were in awe of what he had done, when they said even the wind and the waves obey him.
Right.
And I'm sure that was a very silent trip back to where they were going. But they had to have thought about it for a moment. If they were familiar with some of the Psalms, where only God has the power to do that, they may not have wanted to come to that realization right away, but I think eventually what happened there in that storm convinced them.
Yeah, well, I can see what you're saying. That makes sense, because I was just trying to figure out who were they thinking he was if he wasn't. But I get you. I understand what you're saying.
Yeah, it took a while. They were ordinary people, not with any special religious training. They were just ordinary people that Jesus chose, and I think he chose them for their humbleness because of that, so he could teach them when they wouldn't have, a lot of bad habits that they could have gotten from the Sadducees or the Pharisees and so on. Mm-hmm. But give it some thought.
Yeah, and thank you for that. That's very good conversation. And I tend to agree with you, Harry. And I was going to say, Lois, one example, we have a story of Elijah not feeding 5,000, but he took, a little bottle of oil and a little bit of flour, and he didn't really make it. God made it to where it didn't run out. But it fed them for many days, the Bible says. That should have been enough just to make for one more meal, and that was it. So it's understandable that they could have said, okay, well, this guy has, this Jesus has the spirit of Elijah. He's another very good prophet. And there's also other, Elijah also brought the child back to life that was dead. So that some of the miracles that Jesus did, some of them, not all of them, had already been done before. It was obviously all by God, but he used another vessel to do it. So it's understandable that they could have thought, okay, well, all right, here's another very great prophet.
Well, I understand that, at least in my mind, I was thinking, I know I guess the Jewish religious leaders looked upon him as just another prophet or another person, but I didn't realize his disciples themselves were thinking of him in those terms. That's what kind of confused me.
Yeah.
The Jewish religious leaders didn't accept him as the Son of God.
Absolutely. And that's really my ninth and last point, really, is that these men, they may have not been trained up, but they may have not been trained up as like a Pharisee or a Sadducee, so to speak, but they understood, I'm sure, that they were not to worship any other gods. Right. I mean, that was all throughout. I mean, people could get stoned for those types of things back then. So I'm sure they knew that at a minimum. Yet, they worshiped Jesus, and they finally recognized his deity, his godship. And that's really my last point, is what will it take for you or for us to recognize whom we serve? And that should give us all the reason to not doubt. And this really brings me to where I want to close. And what I have titled here is, you better recognize. People, I'm sure a lot of us maybe have heard that saying. I don't know that it's used so much anymore. I don't know what the new colloquialism would be now. But back in the 90s, people were like, hey, you better recognize who you're talking to, you know, as far as, you know, recognizing who's in charge or who has respect.
Mm-hmm.
And the verses that I'm reading are Hebrews, or that I'm showing is Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 to 3. So just the first 3 verses of Hebrews chapter 1. It says, God, who at sundry times and in diverse manners spake in time past unto the fathers by the prophets, has in these last days spoken to us by his Son, whom he has appointed heir of all things, by whom also he made the worlds, who being the brightness of his glory and the express image of his person, and here's where I start to have some underlines, and upholding all things by the word of his power, when he had by himself purged our sins, and another underline, sat down on the right hand of the majesty on high. This is our ultimate reason to not have any doubt. When we recognize whom we serve, that he upholds all things by his word, and he's seated on the right hand of God, and he's interceding for us, there is no reason for us to have any doubt whatsoever. Now, what I do want to say is I want to come back to this uncertainty, this lack of knowledge of knowing how something will turn out. It is not a sin to have uncertainty. God doesn't always show us the full picture of what's going to happen when God sends us to certain places. He didn't do that even for disciples. He didn't do that even for prophets. He told them to go and do a specific thing. And while they went, things will be unfolded to them. Or as they went and did whatever God commanded them to do, then things will be unfolded to us. So having uncertainty is not a sin. But when that uncertain feeling creeps up and starts to try to turn into doubt, that's when I want us to pray and remind ourselves whom we serve. Let us recognize whom we serve, and don't let that uncertainty turn to doubt. And that concludes all the lesson that I prepared today. I apologize that we went a little bit long, but any questions or any other comments?